that is going to include my face. No worries. It also will not follow you into the breakout room. So what we're going to do is what HLC does during their workshops is that once the session gets started, what we're going to do is, everything will be recorded from then on. But once the actual breakout room session starts, I'll turn the recording off and turn it back on once everyone is back in the room and ready to share their findings. So let's go ahead and get right into it. For our session today, we are going to be covering, let me go ahead and let Josh in. Okay. For this session, we're going to be covering number one, previous report trends. And by report trends, I don't mean nationally, I mean here at Mount West, based upon any of the assessment reports to which we still have access. So those include our spring 2021 fall course assessment report forms and the report forms from our fall 2022 assessment forms as well. And if you are thinking, those exist, but I did not get those, you are right, probably. There have been some issues in getting those back to faculty. We are very aware of that. And during our upcoming assessment boot camp in December, you are going to get those assessment report forms. They are sitting in my office now. They are organized by instructor, and I'm going to get those back to you as quickly as I can on that first day. Additionally, we're going to go over best practices. I do want to note something that has been echoed both in the HLC workshops, but also by our assessment consultant with whom we've been working. And it's that the idea of best practices for every single institution is a little arbitrary in nature because not everything is going to work for every institution. However, we are going to include some that are generally applicable based upon some things that we've noticed as an assessment committee in previous rounds of evaluating these reports. Speaking of the report form, we're going to go over the fall 2024 course assessment form. It is still being completed in a Microsoft Word form. So if you were thinking there are a lot of changes happening, which is true, this is not really one of them. There are some things that we've added, but those are there to prompt additional discussion or to provide additional context, like to which division do you belong. And we're going to go over all of it during the session today. So you'll have an opportunity to see that course assessment form before we even get into the period where in which you would be filling that out. And then finally, we'll have our breakout room session where you get to practice creating a mock report utilizing one of those case studies that I emailed yesterday. There are 3 in total, and you will be assigned a number once you go into your individual breakout rooms. And for those of you who let me know that, you did not get that email, I will send that to you as soon as that session begins. I've got the draft up on my other monitor. So let's go ahead and start with previous report trends, beginning with our outcomes in particular, right? Because that is where everything is driven. And each CETL assessment or each CETL session that is held, and this includes anything that our committees are contributing to as well, is going to have learning outcomes associated with it. And that's for 2 reasons. The first of which is that, let's say, at an eventual in-service session, you have 3 different sessions that you can attend, and you want to pick the one that is best for you. In including learning outcomes, you can decide, okay, well, this one idea, this thing that I want to learn is being offered here and not here. So I'm going to select this session because that's going to be best for me. That's going to help you really orient yourself in terms of getting the information that you need. On the other end, having a learning outcome, in addition to being able to provide context to where this thing is going, it also allows us to assess whether or not you've met that outcome by the conclusion of the workshop. So in this context, our learning outcomes are the following. Number 1, analyze and interpret assessment data. Number 2, summarize assessment data. And then number 3, articulate an improvement or maintenance plan informed by assessment data. So we're really working on that noun data, something that we've been hearing a lot on campus over the last few years. And while you do have a copy of these slides in the email that I sent yesterday, you're also more than welcome to take a picture of this slide, since we will be having a moment to complete a survey at the very end, where in which you get to evaluate how you met these outcomes. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and add those emails to my list. Thank you so much for dropping those in the chat. So these are our learning outcomes for our next 50 minutes to an hour. And we're going to start by providing some context as to what is going on with these assessment report forms, predominantly what's going on after you submit it. Now, on the slide here, it reads, the assessment committee will score them on based on a rubric. And utilizing that predicate there, right, will score, looks like it's going to be in future tense, and that's true, but this is actually something that's been happening for years. And during assessment committee sessions, we have learned that there are some cases where in which faculty are not
This is
entirely.
Lisa.
Hey, Lisa, it's Chris at the Associate Registrar at Mount West Community and Technical College.
Hi. I apologize. This has become harder than it needs to be.
Hi, Chris. If it's
for us
okay,
to
I'm going to
talk. So thank you for calling me again.
Oh, it's no problem at all.
There we go. Okay, cool. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so in thinking about our context here, some faculty just did not know that these report forms were being scored at all. So this is a heads up that not only are they going to be scored in the future, but we are also going to be talking about how they've been scored previously. So if you were not in the know about this, I apologize. Unfortunately, that was not me, but I'm trying to make sure that everyone knows that now, that these assessment report forms are scored based on a rubric. And to make sure that we are all on the same page with regard to this rubric, we are going to go over that together. So you're going to see each individual category, the areas of competency in which you're going to be assessed. And in terms of this rubric, it will still be utilized for the thing that you submit for this round of assessment report form. So this way, all of us know exactly how we're going to be assessed, kind of similar to what we would do with our own students. Before a student turns something in, we always go over the assessment metric with them to make sure that they understand exactly how they're going to be graded. So we want to do the same thing here as well. So we're going to go ahead and start with our competency number 1, or our first component, and that is our course learning outcomes. It is plural. That is something that we talked about in a previous CETL session that was offered with regard to assessment. We are moving away from assessing only one outcome a semester towards assessing multiple outcomes a semester. To kind of give you an idea as to how other colleges are doing that, we had some deans and some chairs or administration who were present at Pikes Peak last week, and they were working with their assessment team. And yes, that is a larger institution. They have a more robust team, but they do in fact assess all of their outcomes every year, for the exception of what would be similar to our allied health folks who have like over 100 outcomes, where in which they do it in individual groups, something that we have talked about as well. And during other workshops that have been happening last week and this week, there have been, and these are also provided by HLC, slides that have assess all outcomes in bold. So we know that we are moving in the right direction there. So our first section is just those course learning outcomes. They have been identified, they have been included in the form. And those outcomes are either going to have been written by your department or by you as an individual if you are a department of one, or given to you by an external accrediting body. In that latter case, probably can't do anything about the writing. But by and large, as we'll see later, our course learning outcomes have been pretty solid. The next is our outcome measure. Your outcome measure is like your assignment, the thing that you utilize to assess that outcome. If your outcome is, my student will interpret a variety of print and digital sources, what assignment are you utilizing to assess how students are able to do that? And then our third component is data. And you can see that we kind of have a range for each one, and this is where things begin to break down in terms of our previous trends. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on that later. But in terms of data as it applies to the rubric, our number 1 score, right, the thing that we really don't want, is data reported does not provide sufficient insight into student achievement of learning outcome. More detailed data is needed. When we talk about writing assessment report forms, this is a big chunk that we want to work on as an institution. And while our number 4 option here, what we really want to shoot for, right, does include utilizing a rubric, it is important to note that not all faculty are going to be using a measure that utilizes a rubric. You might use some kind of exam to assess how your students are meeting multiple outcomes. That is fine. It does, however, mean that you need a bespoke success benchmark. So how are you identifying success for those students? About how many students do you need to get at least a 75% to have said, yes, they did this thing correctly? Our other two components include analysis of data and then our improvement or maintenance plan. Now, the maintenance plan part is new. That was not on previous rubrics. And that is because we are transitioning to assessing every course every year, something we've been talking about for a while. Now, if you're in a situation where you are like, I closed this loop, and for those who are unfamiliar, you open an assessment loop when you assess an outcome for the first time. And let's say, hypothetically, you assess it once and it went really well and almost everybody got an A or a B or a C, then yeah, cool. We can consider that thing excellent. But in the event, the much more likely option that you are assessing something for the first time and you had some that got A's, but a lot that got B's, C's, D's, etc., which can happen, that means your loop is open. That loop does not close until you have documented student improvement. You have changed an element of your activity, of the way that you deliver your information, of the assignment, and have made it so that students have successfully completed that outcome. Now, once you've done that, and let's say that you are kind of maintaining that success, you don't really have an improvement plan, you have a maintenance plan. How are you going to keep students at that benchmark, especially because we are assessing every single year? And to give you an idea of how another institution does this, looking at their assessment matrix, they actually have a rationale section where they talk about why they are reassessing those outcomes every single year and what the instructors are going to be doing each and every year to maintain it and provide rationale for why they do it. So we are, again, definitely moving in the right direction with regard to this idea. So having that improvement plan or a maintenance plan if you're at a really good spot and you want to maintain that spot as best you can, which of course does not mean that it won't change over time. All of us are going to change over time. We're all going to consistently improve. But in this specific case, we do want to, if we're doing something really well, we do want to identify the things that we don't want to change just yet, the things that we think are excellent. And of course, analysis of our data, being able to take any of that descriptive information, that numerical information, and actually utilize it to come to some conclusion about that student's success. If you did have 50% of students that got a C on an exam, why did that happen, do you think? Based on not just the metric that you set or the benchmark that you set, but also looking at the individual questions on the exam or the area on the rubric where in which students weren't scoring so hot. So this is the rubric that will be attached to your assessment form once you turn it in and you get it back in the beginning of February. The beginning of February is the concrete time where in which you are going to get feedback from me. Now, I do want to go ahead and do I need to? Okay. I could hear someone's mic, so I was going ahead and muting some folks just in case. All right, so let's talk about report form trends from spring of 2021 and fall of 2022. So based on those printed rubrics, and I want to be very clear about those rubrics, these sessions for these assessments did happen independently. There's always going to be some inherent subjectivity that comes along with filling out these rubrics. So keeping human interpretation in mind, there were some things on which faculty consistently did really well, and those were course learning outcome and outcome measure. This is great because as far as assessment is concerned, that is the forward-facing part. The course learning outcome is one of the very first things that students are aware of. Even if, let's say hypothetically, they're not in your class yet, maybe they're using one of those master course outlines that we created previously, they can see your list of outcomes. And if it is student-friendly, if they're able to say, oh, I understand exactly what I'm going to be doing in this class, that gives them a certain level of comfort entering that course. And then the outcome measure means that folks kind of across the board had really good assignments. Were there some issues? Of course, there are always going to be, but by and large, the outcome measures, the assignments folks were utilizing to be able to assess student performance were solid. So on the student end of assessment, things were great. On the back end, we struggled pretty consistently with data and analysis of that data. Now, I do want to be clear about the fact that this is not an issue that is unique to Mount West. This is an issue that plenty of different institutions struggle with, both large and small. There are, for instance, in a series of workshops that I've been in recently, there are folks from four-year institutions who have this same problem. So this is not an us problem. It is a larger, at higher education as a whole problem. Predominantly predominantly because there are a lot of moving parts that come along with not just collecting that data, but also interpreting it and then getting it back to faculty. So there's a lot going on there, and that by no means is faculty's fault. It's just something that we're all going to need to work on. So in terms of improving those elements, that is one of the reasons why we have this workshop, to make sure that we are able to touch on those two individual elements. So we're really not going to talk much more about course learning outcomes or the outcome measures, just because based on the ideas of being able to use data to assess what we need to improve on, those are not things that we need to focus on as much. We are instead going to really focus in on that data and how to analyze that data. Now, before we get into some examples and how you might go about handling it, I do also want to kind of open it up to the group here to ask what data you think should be included in an assessment report. So either in the chat or using your microphone, goodness, what data do you think should be included in an assessment report?
I'm going to say a grade breakdown as it concerns the, like Zach just said, distribution of grades.
Yeah, distribution of grades is definitely a good start. It's one of the examples that we're going to talk about for sure. Anything else that you guys think should be in there? You can also say in the chat, I have no idea, which would be a perfectly valid response. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some examples. So if we're talking about data are information collected on student performance from various assessment methods, including but not ultimately, relegated just to quizzes, projects, presentations, and observations. Kim Priest said distribution of grades on a specific assignment as well. Patrick said percentage. James Brooks said how students felt about the course. Kendra said results of your findings. Yeah, absolutely. All of those, 100%. And I'm glad that that includes not just data on letter grades or one bespoke assignment, but also student response to a class, or maybe your response to a class as well. In terms of observations listed here, and then also right here, a little bit more specifically, teacher observations. When we're thinking about closing the loop, or the fact that we are assessing all the time now, which is a good thing, it does mean that there are going to be moments in our data in which we aren't as happy about what we are reporting. And someone, rightfully so, brought up during a workshop, well, if I'm assessing every year and I've done everything to close this loop that I could possibly do, like I've worked really hard to really innovate with this assignment, and I'm really present and I provide lots of resources, and it's a semester in which students just aren't turning things in, or maybe students have a lot going on outside of class and it's not really something that I can help with, I can't close that loop, but how do I mention that in a report? Because that's not on me, which is an important thing to note, right? There are definitely going to be times in which we need to be open to student needs and things of that nature, but sometimes things are just going to be out of our control. If you have a bit of a bummer of a semester, this is a good opportunity to include it. It might be part of why your data looks the way that it does. For example, I've looked at plenty of examples where initially it looks like, oh man, only like 30% of students got an A or a B or a C on this assignment, but at the bottom, it's like, well, 70% of the students didn't turn anything in. And that's a hyperbolic example. That's just a mock example, but it can happen. So teacher observations or student observations can be very helpful. If a student says to you in class, hey, I really like this activity, but I wish we would go slower, or I wish we could have done this, that is something that you can absolutely incorporate. Other things include information that can be numeric or descriptive in nature, any quantitative or qualitative facts related to test and projects, test and assignment scores, and letter grades or performance on rubric criteria. I do want to note, though, that this really runs the gamut of stuff that we can include. And in previous assessment reports, some of the most common pieces of data that we received were letter breakdowns. And letter breakdowns are great, right? Because we can see who got an A, B, C, D, F, whatever. But if that's all we have, that is where we start to have some issues. If a good chunk of your students received a C, For example, and I think a lot of us have been there at some point or another. Why did that happen? Is it because somebody just didn't turn, the correct assignment in? Did they only half complete it? Sure, but maybe there was an issue on the instructor end. And again, I know all of us have been there at some point. What happened for that C percentage to occur? And what can we do to make that better in the long run? Data isn't just the distribution of grades. That's the beginning of it, 100%. But it's also all of these other moving parts. Something that our previous director of assessment talked about a lot was the word narrative, and that we really need narrative-driven assessment. When did this happen in your course? What instruction did they have beforehand? How did the students perform, not just in terms of their grades, but also what questions on this exam did they really struggle with? What area of the rubric were they just not doing so hot on? And how can we then do something with that going forward? That's the data that we really want in terms of these assessment reports. So again, as some like concrete broken down examples, you might have a percentage of the class that earned an A or a B on a measure or ranked excellent or good on a rubric, or a percentage that ranked a C or average, poor, or failed, or did not complete it at all. There are some folks who do include a percentage of the students that did not turn an assignment in. There are some folks who say, I'm not including this because they didn't do it. So how does that assess the measure? Both are valid. They make sense, right? But we do want to make sure we are considering not just the breakdown of these grades or the breakdown of where things are happening in the rubric, but maybe why that happened in the first place, which means going back to basics, thinking about our activities, the lessons, the way in which our assignment sheet was written, whether or not we were doing conferences or hands-on stuff that gave us the opportunity to check in with a student and say, hey, are you learning this? Is there anything I can do for you to help with this information and to really help everything stick in your head? Now, I did mention earlier that best practices as a term are fairly nebulous, just because kind of like the words good and bad, they are hard to quantify. Not everybody's going to have the same definition, but everything provided here by the assessment committee is by and large either touching on something that we've already had an issue with or is something that is just kind of common sense in the context of writing solid assessment reports. So the first of which is brevity being key. That is very important. I struggle with this. When I wrote the English departmental assessment form in fall of 2022, and I gathered everybody's data, I want to say it was over 8 pages long in my Google Doc. And I pretty quickly was like, okay, this is bad for several reasons. And it really, really needed to be condensed because while having a lot of information is good, we can also have some fluff or some other things that could be condensed and will work against the information that we're trying to include if we're including too much. We want to make sure that we are utilizing accessible language as well. So you are not the only person who is going to be reading your report. There is going to be somebody who is assessing that report. And if it is just laden with jargon from your field, that is totally relevant to your field. That is fine. But we want to make sure that someone reading that on the back end, assessing it, giving you assistance, especially considering the fact that the assessment committee is going to be more involved with helping folks learn about assessment and getting, having these meetings with departments and programs with regard to, hey, you said you were going to do this on your form. How is that going? How can we help you, etc. That's going to be a lot easier if that language is completely accessible. Utilizing direct assessments as opposed to indirect assessments. So that means we are focusing on specifically assignments wherein which we are getting concrete information out of that outcome. How did they meet that outcome? It doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about a large group discussion. We might get an idea about, somebody being able to understand or define something in that discussion, but it's not as direct as it could be. And then including a grading rubric and or assignment instructions to provide context as well as the expected benchmark. Previously, there were notes from our previous director of assessment and some other folks, myself included, right? That was the instruction that we had, that going forward, you would have to have a grading rubric. However, like I mentioned earlier, some folks are going to use an exam to assess their assignments, and you probably don't have a rubric for that exam. You probably do, however, have a different metric or benchmark. I want at least 75% of my students to get an 80% or higher. That would make complete and total sense. But we need to have some kind of metric or some kind of benchmark for those students to hit. Otherwise, what are we using to really measure all of this information? We want to make sure that we are analyzing our results completely. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have a breakdown of letter grades, that's awesome. It's a really good start. That is valuable information. You should include it. But if you had a good chunk of students that got a B or a C, why did that happen? Providing those percentages is just the first step. We need to dig a little deeper. What questions on that exam did they have trouble with? If they are struggling with providing supporting evidence or writing thesis statements or whatever component in that rubric needs to be addressed, how do you intend to address it? And that leads me to this next point, right? Ensuring that those actions taken for the improvement or maintenance plan are relevant to the results. Kind of similar to writing an essay. Let's say that you are looking at a psychology essay and somebody wants to write about trauma or the critical period or any number of things related to psychology, and they make a claim in their paragraph. And you think, as the instructor, well, they need evidence to support that thing that they are saying. Your report for your assessment is the same way. If you say, I am going to do X, I'm going to change my activity, I'm going to change my instructions to make it a little bit longer, but a little bit more detailed, or I'm going to add this group discussion or conferences, whatever, make sure that is connected to a specific part of your data. What does that speak to? What specific issue is that designed to fix in the long term? And then finally, and this is less about assessment, but more just about maintenance in general, we really recommend having a secure place to store your results. So I mentioned previously that I wrote the English departmental assessment form in fall of 2022. It is still in my Google Drive. Just in case, and I have needed it previously because that would have been the last round of formal assessment that we had as of now in fall 2024. So in thinking about that round of assessment, I'm still able to reference that even though it was kind of further back in the past here. So when you are completing your assessment form, do you have the option to download it after you complete it? Yeah, absolutely, 100%. You can download it, you can print it, you can keep all of your information in a Word document and then save that to a folder on your computer. Whatever it is that you do is fine, but we want to make sure that we are keeping track of that assessment information, especially since in the assessment form, there are questions about, is this a new loop? What did you do last time? How has this improved X, Y, and Z? And we want to make sure that you are able to speak to that to the best of your ability. And a huge part of that is just holding on to your stuff. Just like we tell students to save their information, we want to make sure that we are saving all of our stuff as well, because there will likely be another time in which we need to utilize it. Now, next we're going to talk about writing the improvement plan. I do have kind of a baked in slide here to ask for questions, comments, concerns, etc. However, I'm going to go ahead and ask that now as well, based on the information we've covered so far. So the rubric, basic recommendations when it comes to what data is and how to talk about it, some of our best practices, before we get into talking about the improvement plan, and then just going through our course assessment form as a team. Do we have any questions, anything that you would like to address before we continue? Rock on. No is a perfectly acceptable answer. Okay, so let's talk about writing the improvement plan and how we do that thing successfully. So we want to define our goals for improvement as best we can, beginning with obviously prioritizing our issues. On your end, there might be some smaller thing that you want to change in Unit 1, but the outcome measure that you were using to assess your these specific learning outcomes was from outcome number 4. You need to prioritize outcome number 4. You need to focus on that unit specifically and not the thing that you mentioned or you're thinking about from the beginning of the semester. You also want to set SMART goals. I love this acronym: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So an example might look like this, quote, increase the percentage of students achieving mastery on course outcome 3 from 65% to 80% within the next academic year, unquote. That's fairly feasible. And having both a time-bound goal, but also something that is measurable, relevant, achievable, really makes it so that 1, you've got a very focused thing that you need to do, and 2, kind of like we talk about with students in College 101, you are not setting an unrealistic goal that you may not be able to meet, which may then be kind of a ding against your own self-esteem as an instructor. If your goal is, I'm going to have every single student getting a 100%, heck yeah, I want that to happen for you, but it may not, right? There are just going to be a lot of variables and a lot of moving parts. So setting these very reasonable, reachable goals are really important. Of course, we want to make sure that everything is evidence-based as well, kind of going back to what we were mentioning earlier, keeping your data directly connected to any plans for improvement that you have. So making sure to link any of those changes directly to any of that descriptive or numerical information. And then finally, being specific about the teaching strategies. You could say something like, I am planning to improve my teaching, which sure, that's a really good first step, but what does that look like? Are you incorporating check-in surveys? Are you going to have a flipped classroom? Are we going to have more peer-to-peer conversations or classroom discussions? Are you changing the pacing? Are you adding fun games? You know, what are you going to do to really help achieve that specific goal? Being able to think, okay, I want this thing to improve is step one, but there are several other steps after that. What specifically do you intend to do? And to be clear, if you're very concrete in this report about I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, when it comes time to write the next report, you can refer back to X, Y, and Z. How did those work? Did they ultimately get you the result that you wanted? And if they didn't, what are you going to try next time? If they did, awesome. Cool. How are you going to maintain that going forward? The more specific you are in terms of how you intend to tweak or change things, the better it's going to be going forward because you've got solid material with which to work. Finally, thinking about our assessment revisions, right? Proposing any changes that may include student improvement and also explaining any potential barriers. You might have students that are inherently resistant to the thing that you want to do. Maybe you think, well, for the last 10 years, this has been a really fun student activity, and now I'm starting to see less and less engagement with it. I am somebody who likes to do like fun games and stuff. I have dog toys that I use as like buzzing noises and things like that for like students who are competing in group activities and stuff. That was awesome 5 years ago. Now, not as fun, right? So I'm trying to figure out ways in which I can continue to engage them. Some things worked 5 years ago that really don't work now. So we want to be cognizant of any issues that those changes might present as well. And while it's not super common that you're going to check this option has always been available in the course assessment form. And that is there going to be a budget associated with this revision? Do you need anything to be able to make this thing happen? And then finally, specifying when those changes will be implemented, keeping in mind we are assessing every course every year. If you are teaching a class in the fall and it only happens every fall, it's going to be implemented next fall. If you are teaching a class like English 101 and it happens literally all of the time, you're assessing it in fall, you're going to implement those things in spring, baby. That thing's going to be happening consistently. It really just depends on when that course is being offered. Now, again, like I said, we do have kind of a baked-in opportunity for questions before we talk about the course assessment form. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns, anything about which you would want to discuss before we get into the actual assessment form? All right, cool. Let's continue. So our assessment form looks like this. Now, of course, this is the editing version, so I'm going to put it in preview so you can see what it's going to look like on your end. If you are new faculty, this is a version of the assessment form that we have been utilizing for a while now. If you are faculty who've been here for a couple years, I mean, I was hired in fall of 2022 and we were using the Microsoft form. It was being used before that, so that's not going to be a major change that you are encountering. In fact, if you're a little worried about data and analysis of said data, we've actually worked as an assessment committee to break down some specific questions that kind of prompt you to include that information. That way, if you're feeling new to some of this and you really want to make sure you nail it right out of the gate, you've got additional guidance. Now, this first screen is pretty basic. It says new faculty or faculty members, and I'll make it a little bigger so everybody can see it. So if you are a department of one, for instance, then yes, you are the one writing your report. If you are in a department like psychology or math or biology or English, it is possible that you are writing the assessment report form for every offering of that course. So if we're talking about English 101, for instance, Zach Rakes is the one who's writing our department form, but he's writing it for everybody. So everybody who teaches English 101, all of their names would be listed here. So any faculty member who is relevant to this report will be listed in this section right here. After that, we'll look at our course number and section. So it could be English Written Communication, English 101, Section 101, or whatever course it is that we are assessing. And then our first new question, which is, to which division do you belong? Liberal arts and transfer studies, career and technical, workforce, or allied health? Now, of course, we cannot progress until we have answers. So I'm just going to slap some nonsense in here so that you can see our next session. After this, you're going to list your course learning outcomes. So there again, we are seeing plural outcomes. Instructors should list 2 or more. If you are in a course in which you do an exam at the very end, and yeah, it assesses all of your outcomes, or you write an essay and it assesses all of your outcomes, feel free to go ahead and list all of them. If you are thinking, oh no, I do not assess all of my outcomes right now, I don't have that kind of assignment, that's fine, all good. You can pick an outcome or a measure that assesses 2 outcomes. That is fine, as long as you've got at least 2. And we're going to have lots of resources and workshops going forward to make sure folks have what they need with regard to that in particular. And then finally, which general education outcome or outcomes are embedded in this course? Note, not all course learning outcomes need to be aligned with a general education outcome. There has historically been some confusion about how that works, but in working with the assessment committee and the Gen Ed committee, this has kind of been their consistent consensus, and that is that not all course learning outcomes need to be aligned with a Gen Ed outcome. So we're going to go ahead and type in our nonsense here so that we can continue. And in this next section, you are going to describe your outcome measure. And I'm going to read the instructions just as they are, because it does provide some additional information. Describe the assignment or measure you used to assess the specified learning outcomes. Ensure the reported measure aligns with the stated learning outcomes and follows guidelines for rigor. The word assignment is not specific enough, and nouns like discussion or group activity are far too vague to adequately assess. So you will describe your assignment here. We can include our nonsense. After that, this is where we get into the stuff in which faculty have struggled a little bit. And again, to reiterate, not a Mount West problem, a higher education problem as a whole. First question is, did you use a rubric to assess this measure? Let's say, yeah, absolutely I did 100%. Our next question is, describe the benchmark for student success with regard to this measure. For example, if you're using an exam, your benchmark might be something like 80% of students will receive at least a 75% on the exam. If we're talking about your rubric, maybe it's at least 80% of students scored really well on X, Y, and Z. Or you could just say, I utilized this rubric to create that benchmark, like I'm focused on these specific things. And after that, you will have an option to attach your rubric. And again, while it did say previously, rubrics are going to be required, the assessment committee has kind of changed their stance on that. Not everybody is going to use an assignment that requires that specific kind of metric. So if you have a rubric, you will attach it. Rubrics are great, but if you're working with an exam, that is okay. And then afterwards, what were the results of this measure? So what was the percentage of students that received an A, B, C, etc.? How many students met the success benchmark? This is where things start to get a little different from how they were previously. Previously, there was a section that was just data analysis. Tell us about your data. And while that's great, we do have new faculty. We have folks who maybe haven't had formal assessment training. I know that prior to me being here, I had a lot that I needed to work on, right? So we wanted to kind of make sure that there were individual steps to prompt folks to include really solid information. So percentage of students that received A, B, or C, that's your letter grade breakdown, your discussion of your student benchmark success. And then what do the results indicate about your students' performance? So based on that previous answer, what do you get out of that evidence? For example, which problem areas were identified in the rubric, exam, etc. We want to be specific. We outline our letter grades, we talk about who met that metric, and then we talk about what that tells us. What issues are there, and what things can we go ahead and start working on, which leads us directly to our next section. But I am going to go ahead and have to put in my nonsense first. All right, that brings us to the last portion of our course assessment form, which is the improvement or maintenance plan. So you are going to describe the way or ways in which your students did or did not meet that success benchmark previously identified. So what was the problem? So we've identified our letter grades. We talked about some issues, right? Now we're going to start fixing them as best we can. And what is your improvement or maintenance plan? Keeping in mind here in bold, instruction can always be improved. There have been previously reports that we have received where folks have said no improvement plan needed. It is totally awesome. And yeah, I believe that you're rocking it and it's awesome, but we can always improve, or at the very least, we can maintain. A maintenance plan in this context is your plan to maintain this level of student success if the sample size met the success benchmark. So if you are thinking, no, I nailed it and my students nailed it, which is awesome. I hope that happens consistently. We want to make sure we've got a plan to make sure that keeps happening. So what do you need, or what do you need to do to be able to make that happen consistently? And then our final questions, things that we have seen before in the previous iterations of this form. Number 14, in which semester will these changes be implemented? Which of course it would be the next semester the course is offered. And then number 15, will you or when will you reassess these outcomes? So if I'm doing an English class and it's offered we're only assessing it in the fall, right? But it's offered all the time, but I'm only assessing it in the fall. English 101 for fall 2024, I would say, yep, we are going to implement those changes next semester. We're going to reassess it in fall. Or if it's a spring class, we're assessing it in the spring. It's offered again in the spring. I'm going to implement those changes next spring. I'm going to assess it that spring as well to kind of give us an idea of where this is going. So ultimately, our course assessment form is really just the version of the form that you've seen before with some tweaks and changes, especially in our data section, to make sure that you've got the information that you need to really make this thing stick. So with that in mind, we want to make sure that kind of as an assessment committee, we've got opportunities to go ahead and give you guys some time to practice putting this thing together. So what we're going to do is I am going to put you guys into breakout rooms, and there are going to be 3 of those breakout rooms specifically. So, and again, if you dropped your email in the chat, I'm going to shoot you an email that has all of the case studies in it. But now that everybody is here, my guess is somebody in your group is going to have a copy of that case study, but I'll send the email just in case. And that case study document looks like this. The case study document has 3 different examples. Each case study document includes the course, the modality, the assignment, the outcomes assessed with that assignment, the context for it, so when it was offered, what instruction students had in brief, the letter grades that students received, the issues they encountered. So everything that you would need to put together a brief, not comprehensive, right? You're just doing a brief outline of that assessment report form based on the information that we just covered. And again, there are 3 of them in total in this document. Each group will be assigned only 1 of them. So you will only have to work with 1, not all of them. And I'll leave this slide up here as I start putting everyone into rooms, because ultimately, your report will need to include the course learning outcomes, the outcome measure, data, analysis of that data, and then the improvement plan. Based on that information, how do they improve it? Based on that data, what are the issues and how can they fix it going forward? So with that being said, go ahead and sit tight, and I am going to start putting all of you into individual break rooms. All right, the rooms are all opening. And as a reminder, I am going to go ahead and turn the recording off while you guys are in those rooms. And I will be going through and facilitating and checking in with each of you during the 10 minutes or so that you're in there. Of their breakout rooms. So we're going to go ahead and start with our case study number 1, which was the English class talking about, these specific outcomes, this informative essay, their context, letter grades, definitely having an issue here because, 50% of the class got a B and not an A. A B doesn't suck, but there's definitely room for improvement, right? So the group that was on number 1, how would you go about putting together this report form, especially when it comes to data and data analysis? Like, what can they do to make this better?
We talked about delivery method, maybe not so much on the PowerPoint slides if they're having issues citing their evidence and going deeper into that outcome number 4. That's really all about we got to.
Okay, what would going deeper into outcome 4 look like? If we're not looking at PowerPoint slides, what would they do?
Zeus.
Okay, then we can go
Sorry,
to...
we did not get that far. There wasn't very much time.
Okay, so what about group 2? So you guys had a little bit more in terms of data, but also fairly comprehensive in terms of the numerical portions in particular. What did you guys say in terms of like, how can this be improved in particular?
We mainly talked to just kind of what each individual one of us in that group does in our courses and how we get to this level of data.
Okay.
And then as far as like what we actually do to work on the improvement plan is founded based on how we actually get data. So like James and I were talking, he's very project based, and
Sure.
getting data on final summative projects has been a challenge for him. So we talked about using rubrics for that and just getting to that level where we've got the data that's similar to what you see here to help us inform that. And we talked with Eileen, we talked about, she's got Scantron forms that does a lot of item analysis. So when she does her exams in biology, across all those sections, they've got the data. It's just a matter of tying it to, the challenge is tying it to the course outcome so we can make it a little bit more meaningful based on the outcome of the course. So that's mainly what we kind of talked about. We were short on time, but that's what we got.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you guys were able to do a lot, though, especially if you're talking about the different ways in which you can get data and where that has been an issue historically. Then those are worthwhile conversations to have, especially if they're happening across different disciplines and folks are going to be pulling them from different areas. Because, yeah, you can get stuff from Blackboard. Blackboard's great, but there are definitely other ways in which you can get it as well. What about group 3?
For us, it was largely like the outcomes were very clear. The context was very strong. The data was there. It was largely the improvement plan that we were kind of focusing on more of what can be done. Like a lot of problem areas were identified, but it was what can we do or what can this person do to outline an improvement plan of some kind.
Sure. Yeah. Any idea for what they could do in terms of improvement? Like what?
It was more or less like we talked about potential for like a practice time because apparently like eye contact was perhaps a weak area in their speech. So in that delivery, so perhaps building in some kind of a practice period for these students, especially because this was like a 4-week long assignment.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. All right. And then there's a response in the chat here. Okay, cool. That was so to Josh specifically from James, but also it was included to everybody. I won't read it out loud just in case it was just kind of meant for Josh, but there is some worthwhile information about students meeting, specific outcomes and utilizing specific methods for that. So awesome. Fantastic. Okay. I understand we were a little short on time. I kind of wanted to keep you in there longer, but just in case you're teaching here soon, if you were able to have a conversation about data, about the information that is provided, my hope is that in looking at things like these letter grades, you are really starting to see that that's not enough in terms of saying I need to improve. Or if we're saying, okay, this element needs to improve, how do you specifically do that? Because identifying it is step 1, but we really need to have concrete examples as to where that goes in the future. Now, in terms of other resources that are available, we do have, let me check the, okay. We do have some resources available on the CEDL's YouTube channel. So anything we've recorded with regard to assessment is there, but there are also links, especially on the CEDL website, which should be up in very soon. There are links to other institutions and other CEDLs. We're working to get to where they are, but they've got tons and tons of resources available for assessment. And we also have a lot of other assessment resources that were discussed in previous workshops. And that will be available on the site as well. So to make sure that we are maintaining our time here as best we can, we're going to go ahead and conclude here. There is a QR code that will take you to the evaluation survey that goes for every single session that we do for the CEDL, for any session put on by a committee, just to make sure we're able to meet those outcomes. As a reminder, and I'll go ahead and remind you of what our outcomes were in terms of, as they pertain to this specific session. And our outcomes were analyze and interpret assessment data, summarize assessment data, and articulate an improvement plan or maintenance plan informed by assessment data. So looking at all of those examples, looking at all of those best practices, etc. So if you would utilize this QR code. And as a reminder, you've got a copy of the slides in your email, so you can also find it there. So if you would utilize this QR code to take that brief survey so the CEDL can continue improving, we would thoroughly appreciate it. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.